The summer of 1999 settled softly over Magnolia Creek, a peaceful town in southern Mississippi where time moved at its own rhythm. The air was warm, sweet with honeysuckle, and the distant hum of cicadas. Streets wound gently between oak trees and brick storefronts, where families gathered on porches after sundown and neighbors greeted one another with easy smiles. In that tranquil season, 25-year-old Nora Caldwell was a familiar presence in nearly every corner of town. She worked as a local art teacher at Magnolia Creek Elementary, guiding her students with warmth and patience. Her classroom was known for its bright murals, painted by the children under her supervision, filled with sunflowers, rivers, and birds. Nora's life was simple but fulfilling. She lived in a small cottage just outside town, tended a garden, and spent weekends helping her mother, Helen, at the family's small bakery on Main Street. Those who knew Nora described her as gentle and attentive, with a love for quiet detail. She often carried a sketchbook wherever she went, filling its pages with drawings of Magnolia Creek's landscapes, the wooden bridges, the local church, the shaded park where children played. She had plans to illustrate a children's book someday, inspired by her students' stories. On the morning of July 17, 1999, Nora left home to attend a summer arts program in Hattiesburg, about an hour away. It was meant to be a weekend workshop where teachers shared lesson ideas and new creative techniques. She packed her sketchbook, a folder of lesson plans, and a packed lunch her mother had prepared, a turkey sandwich, an apple, and a small piece of lemon cake. She left a note on the kitchen counter that read, "Back Sunday evening, love you." By evening, the sun dipped below the pine trees, and Helen expected to hear Nora's car pull into the gravel driveway as usual. When the hours passed without sound, she felt only quiet uncertainty. The roads between Hattiesburg and Magnolia Creek were long and lined with forest. By morning, Helen called the workshop organizers. They confirmed that Nora had attended the Saturday morning session and left during the lunch break, sketchbook in hand, intending to visit the nearby botanical gardens before heading home. When Nora's car was found 2 days later near a small rest stop along County Route 42, it was parked neatly, locked and undisturbed. Inside were her art supplies and sketchbook, still on the passenger seat. The sketches showed trees, flowers, and a winding footpath near a lake, the last page half finished, as if paused mid-stroke. Magnolia Creek came together immediately. Friends, family, and volunteers searched the wooded areas around the rest stop. The sheriff's department coordinated efforts with local search teams, using maps and photographs to cover the terrain. For a week, the town moved as one. People brought food, organized search lines, and kept candles burning at the church each evening. The story of Nora Caldwell spread through Mississippi's news channels, reaching nearby counties. Reporters described the search as one of the largest community-driven efforts of that summer. Neighbors from adjoining towns arrived with flashlights and boots, walking through the tall grass and pine trails under the steady guidance of Sheriff Thomas Riley, a calm and measured leader respected by all. The search teams found signs of Nora's path near the botanical gardens, footprints by the lake's edge, a pencil dropped beside a patch of wildflowers, and the faint impression of her shoes on a trail. Yet no further trace appeared that summer. Despite the uncertainty, the community refused to lose focus. Each Sunday, Helen and other families gathered at the bakery, sharing updates and memories. They organized art drives in Nora's name, keeping her classroom open and continuing her students' mural projects. In every stroke of paint, her spirit remained present. Sheriff Riley documented every step of the investigation with meticulous care. He preserved photographs, witness notes, and objects from the site. Though the years moved forward, he ensured that nothing from the case was ever misplaced. By the time he retired in 2012, he had passed on a perfectly preserved archive to the county's newly formed Cold Case Division, led by Detective Ava Thornton. By then, Magnolia Creek had changed, new businesses had opened, children had grown up, and technology had quietly transformed the world. But Nora's memory endured. Her murals still decorated the elementary school walls, bright and untouched. Her sketchbook, sealed in evidence storage, remained crisp and intact, waiting for answers that time alone could not yet provide. In 2019, a review of long-standing investigations across Mississippi reached Magnolia County. The state's forensic unit had begun applying newly refined DNA methods to re-examine preserved materials from unsolved files. Detective Ava Thornton, methodical and deeply empathetic, revisited the Caldwell case with calm determination. She reopened the archives one evening in June, laying out the old files under bright white light. The air smelled faintly of paper and ink, the marks of years of care. Inside, she found Sheriff Riley's handwritten notes, the photographs of Nora's car, and the carefully sealed evidence packets. Among them was a small envelope labeled Rest Stop Pathway, 7/1899, containing a fabric thread that had been collected from a low branch near the lakeside path. Back in 1999, such a thread would have been nearly impossible to analyze. But 20 years later, technology had advanced remarkably. Ava submitted the sealed sample to the state's modern laboratory in Jackson, ensuring the chain of custody remained intact. While waiting for results, Ava visited Magnolia Creek to meet Nora's mother, Helen, who still managed the bakery on Main Street. The bell above the door chimed as Ava entered, the scent of cinnamon and sugar filling the air. Helen greeted her with gentle warmth. Her hair had turned silver, but her eyes carried the same kindness Nora's friends remembered. Ava explained that she was re-examining the case, speaking softly but clearly. Helen listened carefully, her hands steady on the counter. She didn't ask for promises. She simply thanked Ava for remembering. That evening, Ava walked through Magnolia Creek's quiet streets, pausing by the elementary school where Nora had once taught. Children's laughter echoed faintly from the playground, and the mural Nora had designed still glowed with color. Ava stood there for a long moment, recognizing that the story she was piecing together was not only about evidence, but about continuity, how love and memory persist through time. 2 weeks later, a call arrived from the state laboratory. The analyst explained that the preserved fabric thread contained trace DNA, successfully isolated and matched through a national database. The profile connected to an individual named Caleb Morris, who had once worked in landscaping and grounds maintenance in neighboring Jefferson County. Ava reviewed his background carefully. Caleb had moved frequently through the early 2000s, taking jobs across southern states, but had lived in Magnolia Creek briefly during the late 1990s. He had been hired to maintain the grounds at the Botanical Gardens, the same location Nora had planned to visit that afternoon. The discovery was significant, but Ava approached it with care. She verified every record, ensuring each connection was documented. She compared old photographs, visitor logs, and time cards from 1999, establishing that Caleb had indeed been scheduled to work at the gardens, the same weekend Nora attended her workshop in Hattiesburg. The findings offered not accusation but clarity, pieces of a story long scattered by time. Ava shared the information with Helen in person, explaining what had been learned. They sat together at the bakery table, the late sunlight pouring through the window. Helen placed her hand over the folder, her expression calm. "I always believed her story would return," she said softly. Ava continued her research with quiet persistence. She tracked Caleb's later life, discovering that he had lived peacefully for years, working in community maintenance and volunteering at local shelters. His health had declined in recent years, and records showed he now resided in a care facility in Biloxi. In coordination with state authorities, Ava arranged to meet him. The visit was approached respectfully, focused on understanding, not confrontation. She carried with her the original sketches from Nora's book, now carefully copied, and photographs of the botanical gardens. When Ava entered the care facility, she found Caleb sitting by a window overlooking the Gulf, the lights soft and golden. He greeted her politely. Their conversation was calm, centered around memory, history, and the passage of time. Ava asked gentle questions about his years working at the gardens, about the people he met, and the days he remembered. As he spoke, his recollections came slowly but steadily. He remembered the gardens vividly, the lilies, the bridge, the afternoon light that filtered through the trees. And then, with quiet realization, he mentioned a young woman with a sketchbook who had stopped to talk with him about the flowers that summer. He described her kindness and curiosity, how she had asked about local plant names and thanked him for his time. Ava listened carefully, her pen resting on the page. There was no need for interrogation. The facts themselves spoke gently, forming a picture of a single moment that had echoed across decades. Outside, the Mississippi breeze carried the scent of salt and magnolia. Ava felt that clarity was near, that the story of 1999 had not been lost but simply waiting like a seed beneath soil, patient until the right season arrived. When Detective Ava Thornton returned to her office in Jackson, she carried with her the weight of time and the clarity of understanding. The meeting in Biloxi had not been about evidence alone. It had been about memory. She organized her notes methodically, listing each connection she had traced, ensuring that the facts were documented with respect and precision. The state laboratory's findings were comprehensive. The partial DNA sample from the thread matched the preserved records of Caleb Morris with a high degree of certainty. It was one of the most conclusive results obtained through Mississippi's 2019 statewide review program. The report was accompanied by photographs, chain of custody documentation, and a summary of analytical methods. Every detail aligned seamlessly, confirming that the modern science had met the diligence of the past. Ava knew that in many ways this discovery was about preservation, the quiet, careful choices made by those who had handled the case before her. Sheriff Thomas Riley's insistence on proper evidence storage had allowed this moment to exist. It was as if his commitment had bridged the 2 decades between Nora's last summer and the present day. She called him at his home in Laurel to share the news. His voice, calm and thoughtful, reflected gratitude. "I always hoped," he said. "We kept it safe for this reason." Together, they planned to review the entire case file once more, ensuring that no piece of information was left unexplored. Ava arranged to meet Sheriff Riley at the Magnolia Creek Courthouse, where the old records room still held rows of boxed archives labeled in his handwriting. When she arrived, the former sheriff was waiting beside the large oak table, the files stacked neatly before him. His hair was white now, his uniform replaced by a simple shirt, but his attention to detail remained unchanged. They spent the afternoon reviewing witness statements, photographs, and reports. Riley explained each entry as though it had been written yesterday. They looked again at the map of the botanical gardens, tracing the path Nora would have walked from the visitor center to the lake. The map was faded but legible. Ava noted that the location where the thread was found lay close to a maintenance shed, once used for storing tools and supplies, an area Caleb had been assigned to supervise. The timeline formed clearly now. Nora had likely stopped to sketch by the water, perhaps speaking briefly with Caleb as he tended the grounds. Something had caused her to leave her car at the rest stop and walk along the nearby trail, drawn by the flowers and sunlight. The interaction between them appeared brief and courteous, yet the trace fabric had connected their paths. With all findings in order, Ava prepared her final summary for the State Review Board. It was comprehensive and factual, describing how preserved evidence, community cooperation, and scientific progress had combined to reveal the truth of Nora Caldwell's final day. The board reviewed her report and authorized a public announcement, recognizing the case as successfully resolved. Before any statement was made, Ava visited Helen Caldwell again. She arrived at the bakery early one morning, just as Helen was opening for the day. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, touching the framed photographs of Nora that lined the wall behind the counter. Helen greeted her with quiet composure. Ava explained that the case had reached its conclusion, that every available fact had been examined, and that the sequence of events from that summer was now clear. Helen listened, her eyes soft. "Thank you for caring," she said simply. "I always believed someone would." Later that afternoon, Ava met with the county's media liaison and Sheriff Riley to prepare a community announcement. They agreed to hold it at the town library, a fitting place where stories and history were preserved together. Invitations went out to local residents, former students of Nora's, and community leaders who had taken part in the original searches 2 decades earlier. On the evening of the announcement, the library filled with familiar faces. Chairs lined the aisles, and the air carried the scent of paper and polished wood. Photographs of Nora's murals and drawings were displayed near the entrance. The local news station set up quietly at the back, their cameras steady but unobtrusive. Sheriff Riley began with a few words of gratitude, thanking the citizens of Magnolia Creek for their patience and cooperation. He described the case's long journey, how the evidence collected in 1999 had been carefully preserved, and how modern science had finally provided clarity. Ava then stepped forward, speaking gently and factually. She explained the laboratory findings, the historical context, and the significance of technological advancements in DNA analysis. When she mentioned Caleb Morris's name, she spoke of him only in terms of verification and timeline. Her language remained respectful, emphasizing the importance of factual accuracy rather than judgment. The goal was not division or blame, but understanding. Helen sat near the front, her hands clasped together. When the presentation concluded, she rose and thanked both Ava and Sheriff Riley. The audience joined in quiet applause, a gesture of collective relief. The atmosphere was serene, filled with appreciation for the diligence that had finally brought resolution. After the gathering, Helen invited several attendees back to the bakery for coffee and pastries. They shared stories about Nora, her laughter, her patience with children, the way she would hum softly while painting. Former students recalled how she encouraged them to see beauty in small things, the texture of a leaf, the shimmer of water on glass, the play of color in everyday life. Detective Ava listened, taking notes not for a report but to preserve these memories. She understood that justice was not only about documents and tests, but about people, the continuity of memory and kindness across time. Over the next weeks, Magnolia Creek experienced a gentle renewal of connection. Local news outlets published feature stories about the case, focusing on the science behind its resolution and the resilience of the community. Nearby schools organized art events in Nora's memory, displaying student work inspired by her sketches. Her former classroom at Magnolia Creek Elementary was refurbished and renamed the Caldwell Creative Room. The mural she had started with her students remained untouched, vibrant even after 2 decades. New generations of children walked those halls, learning about the teacher whose drawings had filled their world with color and care. For Ava, the Caldwell case became a touchstone, a reminder of the value of time, patience, and preservation. She continued her work in the cold case division, often using Nora's file as an example during presentations. She emphasized the importance of detailed record-keeping, community trust, and the pursuit of understanding through science. Each year she returned to Magnolia Creek for the town's art fair. In 2021, she attended as a guest speaker, invited by the local Arts Council. Standing under the shade of the same oak trees Nora had once drawn, she addressed the gathering. This case taught us that stories do not disappear. They wait quietly until care and knowledge bring them to light again. Helen, seated near the front, smiled as she listened. Children painted nearby on long rolls of paper, their hands covered in bright colors. The sight filled her with peace, not because the past had been changed, but because it had been honored. As the sun set over Magnolia Creek that evening, the town glowed in shades of gold and amber. The streets were alive with gentle laughter, music from the bandstand, and the hum of conversation. In every corner, the memory of Nora Caldwell lingered, not as sorrow, but as inspiration. Her story had become part of the town's identity, a symbol of care, perseverance, and unity. In late 2022, the state recognized the case as one of Mississippi's most successfully resolved cold cases of the decade. The report cited the cooperation between local law enforcement, state laboratories, and the community as a model of collaboration. Detective Ava Thornton received commendation for her leadership, which she accepted modestly, crediting those who had begun the work long before her. At home that evening, she looked through a copy of Nora's sketchbook, which Helen had donated to the local museum. The pages were filled with drawings of fields, rivers, and the magnolia blossoms that gave the town its name. On the last page, unfinished yet graceful, was a sketch of the town square, the church steeple, the bakery window, and children walking together with art supplies in hand. The image captured everything Magnolia Creek had become, a place of connection, care, and quiet strength. Ava closed the book gently, reflecting on how one teacher's life continued to inspire so many. She made a final note in her own journal that evening. Time does not erase truth. It preserves it for those willing to listen. The courtroom in Jackson filled slowly that September morning in 2023. Wooden benches creaked as residents of Brookmere filed in, their faces quiet but watchful. Reporters took their places near the front, notebooks open, cameras ready. It had been almost 24 years since anyone had spoken the name Lena Cartwright aloud in this kind of room. Detectives Carla Mendez and Paul Grayson sat near the front, both in plain suits. They had spent years chasing the truth that now stood at the center of the courtroom, between two lawyers and a solemn judge. The man in question, Samuel Dyer, once a familiar face in the town's farming circle, sat still beside his attorney. His hands rested flat on the table, motionless. As the court clerk called the case number, the sound echoed sharply across the chamber. Lena's younger sister, Caroline, now in her late 40s, sat in the first row. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a small silver locket that had belonged to Lena. Her eyes stayed fixed forward, not at Samuel, but at the photo board near the evidence table, Lena's smiling face from 1999, her hair caught in a warm breeze. The prosecutor began calmly, explaining how time and science had done what memory could not. For years, she said, the evidence sat sealed, waiting for the right tools. In 1999, we did not yet have the capacity to extract a clear DNA sequence from the sample left on Lena's jacket. But in 2022, with the help of forensic genealogy, That same sample spoke. It led investigators to a match, a local man who once helped the Cartwright family during the summer harvest. She turned toward the jury, her voice steady. The truth does not fade, it waits. The defense attorney stood next, speaking softly about Samuel's years of good work, his age, his family. But the facts in front of the jury painted a different picture. A quiet man who had lived within miles of Lena's family home all along. Witnesses were called. Detective Mendez testified about the reopened case, describing how old case files were digitized and cross-referenced through a national database. We weren't expecting a hit, she told the jury. But when it came, it matched not just one sample, but two, one from the jacket, one from a piece of rope found near the creek. Paul Grayson followed her on the stand. He explained how the renewed testing linked to public DNA profiles through genealogical research. It led to relatives of Samuel Dyer, he said, and from there we confirmed the direct match. Each word drew the room tighter. No one moved. When Caroline was called to speak, she took a quiet breath before stepping forward. Lena was 23, she began softly. She had just finished her teaching degree. She wanted to start an after-school reading program at the community center. She loved this town, even when she had reasons not to. We always believed someone would listen again someday. Her voice never broke, but her hands held the locket a little tighter. The defense offered no witnesses beyond Samuel himself. When he rose, the courtroom felt smaller. He spoke quietly, only acknowledging that he had known Lena through local gatherings. "I can't explain the evidence," he said, eyes downcast, "but I never wished harm to anyone." The silence that followed was long and heavy. 2 days later, the jury returned. The foreperson stood, reading the verdict. "We find the defendant, Samuel Dyer, guilty." The air shifted, like a deep-held breath finally released. Caroline's eyes closed for a moment. She did not weep. She only whispered a quiet thank you toward the photograph at the front of the room. Outside the courthouse, a soft drizzle began to fall, not the cold kind, but the kind that seemed to settle everything back into the soil. Reporters asked for comments, but the family walked quietly to their car. Detective Mendez watched them go, her expression calm, her posture still proud. Weeks later, the town of Brookmere began to heal in small ways. The Cartwright home was still there, its white porch railings freshly painted by neighbors who remembered Lena's kindness. Children played in the yard again. Caroline often sat on that same porch, sipping coffee as the morning fog rolled across the fields. One afternoon, she received a letter from the state crime lab, a copy of the final DNA confirmation, and a note of thanks for her patience. She folded the letter and placed it beside the locket. On another day, she met with Detective Mendez at the town library. They spoke about setting up a small reading program there, just as Lena had wanted. "It's what she dreamed of," Caroline said, smiling faintly. "Maybe this way she still gets to help." The library hosted its first reading night a few months later. Children gathered on soft mats, their parents nearby, as volunteers read stories about courage and kindness. A framed picture of Lena sat on a small shelf beside a sign that read the Cartwright Reading Corner. The sign became a quiet symbol of hope, a promise that time could not erase. In the police department archives, Mendez placed a final note in the case file: "Justice achieved. Family found peace." Then she closed the folder carefully and returned it to its drawer, where hundreds of others waited, each carrying stories of patience and persistence. Brookmere carried on gently. The grain silos still caught the sun each evening, and the river still curved through town with the same calm rhythm. But those who had lived through the decades-long wait understood something deeper now. that even in silence, truth moves slowly but surely until it finds its way home. In the years that followed, Lena's story was taught in local schools, not as tragedy but as an example of endurance and community strength. Caroline often visited classrooms, telling children that kindness and truth are stronger than fear. She always ended her talks with the same line Lena once wrote in her college journal, words that had survived the years in a notebook found after her passing. Even if time forgets, love remembers. And so it did. The fields around Brookmere bloomed each spring, brighter than before, and the town that had once waited in silence now lived with quiet peace. Justice had arrived, not loud, not bitter, but gentle, like the morning light after a long night.